Welcome, scholars and alumni, to our first of two sessions on ITINs Open Doors. My name is Nicole Wesley, Senior Program Manager of Career Supports at TheDream.Us. Please know that this event will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel by early next week. Also, please make sure to mute your mics as you are coming in. During today's event, there will be about 30 minutes of presentation followed by Q&A. So if you have any ITIN related questions, feel free to include them in the chat. Next slide. Before we begin, I also want to briefly highlight our ITIN website and the amazing resources you can find there. ITINs are a powerful tool for those who are not eligible for a Social Security number. An ITIN is an individual taxpayer identification number that is issued by the IRS for individuals to file and pay taxes. Beyond using an ITIN to file and pay taxes, an ITIN can also be used to open a bank account, apply for an EIN, and pursue entrepreneurial career opportunities through independent contracting, freelancing, and starting a business. Please note, an ITIN does not provide legal status nor work authorization. For more information on ITINs, check out our ITIN website. Next slide, please. I also want to just highlight our upcoming webinars. So we will have a second ITINs Open Doors webinar in mid-March. And then we will also have next week, same time, same day on Thursday, February 22nd. We will also have a webinar on tax matters for immigrants. So if you do have any tax related questions or want to learn more about taxes, I encourage you to attend next week's webinar. With that, I am also going to introduce our guest speaker for today. And I'm going to pull up her intro. All right, so introducing our guest speaker, Professor Francine Littman. Professor Francine Littman is a professor of law at UNLV's Boyd School of Law. Her areas of expertise include tax law and taxation of business entities. Professor Littman is a frequent speaker on tax subjects to law and business groups and works with undocumented immigrants, including entrepreneurs, in their tax-related endeavors. With that, thank you, Professor Littman, again for your time today and expertise. I will pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, and welcome students across the country. It's very exciting to be in the same room with each and all of you. And I hope this presentation answers some questions for you. I do want to applaud TheDream.Us because the resources that Nicole and her teams have put together are truly phenomenal. So I would even say share them broadly because they're well done and very accessible. So please do not hesitate to ask questions. That's pretty much why I'm here. As you may or may not know, an ITIN, which, as Nicole said, is an individual taxpayer identification number. So that's an acronym, and every taxpayer must have a taxpayer identification number. I have one, and I have a Social Security number. If you do not qualify for a Social Security number, then your taxpayer identification number is an ITIN. An ITIN is actually readily identifiable because it looks like a Social Security number with 9 digits and dashes in between, but an ITIN always starts with a 9. So if you see a number that you have or someone has that starts with a 9, that is an ITIN. You might have parents or grandparents, and I know I work with undocumented immigrants who do have social security numbers that are actually their social security numbers that they qualified at the time of issuance. And prior to 1996, which I'm sure sounds like a long time ago to most of you, maybe even before you were born, the US Treasury would issue social security numbers pretty much to anyone. Beginning in 1996, during the Clinton administration, President Clinton, the US Treasury stopped that. And so from a going forward basis, since 1996, moving forward, if you did not qualify for work authorization, then the default is if you have a tax filing obligation to use an ITIN. So I work with, as I said, undocumented immigrants who have social security numbers. They are undocumented, so that social security number does not allow them to work, but that is their number, and they are not supposed to file for an ITIN. ITINs are issued on a letter. A social security number is issued on a little blue card, kind of a small card like a credit card. However, again, this is a dynamic situation. So there are some, maybe your mom or grandmother has an ITIN that was issued on a card. ITINs were originally issued on cards that look like Social Security cards, except interestingly, ITINs are green and Social Security cards tend to be blue. And so maybe a mom or grandma has one of those, but for many years now, they're issued on letters, so it's not confusing. If anyone is physically present in the United States for more than 183 days, and there's a look back period, so that's basically over 3 years, that they are characterized under federal tax laws as a resident alien. I apologize for using that word. I find it to be off-putting, but that is the technical term used in the law. And this is only for tax purposes, so it doesn't provide any sort of legal residency. In order to qualify for an ITIN, you have to be ineligible for a Social Security number, and you have to have a tax filing obligation. So you have to have earned income or have perhaps qualify for a educational tax credit. You have to have a reason that you have to file a tax return. The federal government only provides these numbers for tax filing. And so if you don't have a tax filing obligation, you don't qualify for an ITIN. You can't see someone with an ITIN and assume that they're unauthorized. The ITIN is also used by foreign investors in US businesses. So foreign investors also don't qualify for Social Security numbers. They use the ITIN. Once a person is issued an ITIN, even if your ITIN expires, and once you have an ITIN, if you don't use it on a tax return for 3 consecutive years, then it expires and you have to renew it. How do you renew it? You file a tax return and you file the application process again. But once you use the same number, so once it expires, then you just renew it and you have the same number. Once you qualify for a Social Security number, then you use the Social Security number and do not use the ITIN ever again. And ITIN, as Nicole said, the purpose is for federal tax filing. However, not surprisingly, a lot of businesses use it for other reporting purposes. So for example, opening an interest-bearing account, getting a home mortgage, getting a driver's license in certain states. If you're applying for a scholarship, if you are trying to start your own business and you want an employer identification number, you must have a taxpayer identification number like an ITIN first to get the EIN. The benefits are complying with any tax filing obligations. To the extent we ever have immigration reform, and my fingers and toes are crossed, one of the conditions precedent will be that you have filed all your taxes and paid all your taxes. And so you want to comply with the federal tax laws. In addition, there are certain tax benefits that individuals with ITINs qualify for. So for example, there are many states now across the country that have certain, it's often a child tax credit or certain tax benefits that ITIN holders can file for. In addition, it is perceived by a lot of federal judges as good moral character that if you have filed your taxes in a timely manner. It's also very helpful. I am a law professor, and so it's very helpful to look back at tax returns to remember your address, where you were living, what you were doing, etc. It's also important that that tax return be consistent with your life. So if you're married, you need to file married filing jointly. If you're dependent of your parents, then they need to claim you on their tax return. So your tax return is good evidence of your life. You might already have an ITIN and you don't even know it. Your parents, to the extent your parents have been filing income taxes and they claim you as a dependent, then they would have had to file for an ITIN for you. How can you find that? Well, ask your parents. My experience working with parents who are unauthorized is they're very good at keeping their paperwork. And so ask your parents. They hopefully will have the ITIN assignment letter. If they don't have that letter, then perhaps they have their tax return. And if you're listed on their tax return in the dependent section, which you likely were, and maybe you still are, if you still qualify, you can look to see your name, and then your ITIN number should be there under the heading of Social Security number. So how do you get an ITIN? Well, unfortunately, it is a slow, cumbersome, and very manual process. The IRS and US Treasury are trying to modernize this, but I tell you, it's very slow going. So on its face, it kind of looks simple. The form that you use is a Form W-7, and I'm confident if you Google that, it'll pop right up. It's a one-page form, but you have to be somewhat careful filling it out. So we're going to look at how to fill it out together. So here's the top half of the W-7, and up at one of the very common errors is people do not check the box up at the top. So as you can see on the right above my head there, you can see that it says application type, either applying for a new ITIN or renewing an existing ITIN. So you check the box that's relevant. If you don't have an ITIN, it'll be applying for a new ITIN. If you already have one and it's expired, then you're renewing your ITIN. Then this next section is honestly the most complicated section and not straightforward. But the good news is you've got great helpers, including me. You are going to want to check box C if you as an individual have a tax filing obligation. So let's say you're 25 years old, you've got a job, and you're also going to school, but you're self-sufficient. So you're not claimed as a dependent on your parents' tax return, then you're going to check box C as in cat. You're a U.S. resident alien that's based upon days physically present in the U.S., and you have to file a federal tax return. If you are claimed on your parents' tax return and they're filing the return, then you're a dependent of a U.S. Citizen or a resident alien, and you're going to check box D as in dog. And then you have to enter on this line the relationship to the U.S. citizen or resident alien, so it could be parent. If you are married to a U.S. citizen or resident alien and you're going to file on married filing joint tax return, then you check box E as in elephant. And similarly, you put the name and the social security number or ITIN of your spouse. It is not likely you're going to be checking any other boxes. So either C as an individual filing your tax return, D as a dependent, or E as a spouse. And then let me scroll back. So on here, the next line is your first name. So that's pretty easy. Make sure you're consistent on all your documents, your first name, your middle name, your last name. If you got married, so your name changed, then you have to put your original name on the next slide. Then the balance of the form is basically your address. So you put your applicant's mailing address. Make sure that is an address that you can get mail at, because I tell you, the IRS doesn't email, they don't TikTok. They contact you through U.S. Postal Service. So you want to make sure that's a good address. You don't need a foreign address, so leave line 3 blank. Line 4, you put your birth date. You also put your country of birth, city and state or province where you were born is optional. This form is not very updated. It just has gender, male or female, so check a box. Your country of citizenship is line 6A. That is not going to be the United States, and so do put your country of citizenship. If you have a foreign ID number, put it down. If you don't, just put NA for not applicable. So any box you're not putting anything down in, just put NA, not applicable. If you have a US visa, not likely, so 6C is probably going to be NA. And here, these are the identification documents that you're going to submit, meaning it's not just this form, unfortunately. You have to attach this form to documents that identify who you are and also to a tax return. The best document I hope you have, and we're going to talk about documents in a minute, is a passport. You want an unexpired passport, so you're going to hopefully check that box or the other boxes as applicable. You'll put who issued it, the number, the expiration date, and here is probably one of the most challenging questions for many. Date of entry into the US. I work with a myriad of different individuals, and some elders can't remember the date they specifically entered. I try to jog their memory by saying, was it summer? Was it winter? Was it spring? You need to put something down here. So if that's a kind of a guess, that's okay. But definitely put something down there. And I have never had an ITIN application rejected because it didn't comply with the information they have. Very likely the United States government doesn't have that date either, but definitely put a date down there. Have you previously received an ITIN? So if you have previously received an ITIN, then this has to be a renewal. You had an ITIN, it's expired, then you're renewing it. If you had an ITIN, then you enter it on box 6F. If it's a different name that it was issued under, perhaps put it down. And line 6G as in goat is not relevant, and so leave that blank or put NA. Then you're going to sign it, date it, and I usually do not put a phone number, so you just might leave that NA or blank. That's the form. This little slide here basically restates what I just described. As I'm sure you might guess, this PowerPoint and a recording of this presentation is going to be available, so you can review this at your leisure. Unfortunately, that's not the end of the story. So now you've got your W-7 filled out. As I said, it's pretty straightforward, but now you need to get someone, including maybe yourself, preparing a tax return. So the application for an ITIN must have the W-7, and it also must have a completed tax return. This is all going to be filed on paper. So if you do not have an ITIN, you cannot file electronically. The software will not allow it. So you're going to have to take a paper return, a paper W-7, and then you're going to put all of that together with your identification documents. And these documents, it's gut punch for me to say this, but you are required to send in original documents or certified copies from the issuing agency. There is an alternative to this, which I'll describe. The best document that proves identity and your foreign status is a passport. If you don't have a passport, there are other alternatives. The good news is a lot of states, including the great state of Nevada, where I live, you can get a driver's license regardless of your immigration status, at least in Nevada. So that is likely the alternative to a passport. So you need a picture ID. And so passports have a picture, a US driver's license has a picture. If you don't have that, then a foreign driver's license, if you have one, again, unexpired, a US state ID card, very unlikely, a US military ID card. So if you don't have a passport, you need a document that proves your identity and a document that proves you're foreign born. So The best foreign-born document that I generally see is a birth certificate. So you need the original birth certificate. Some other options are foreign voters registration card, again, unexpired, a visa issued by the US State Department. These are options that are not really relevant likely to your life. So if you don't have the passport, the most likely alternatives are US driver's license and your birth certificate. Passport again proves both. Now, how do you avoid submitting your original documents? Because of course, you're not going to want to not have your driver's license with you. So you would only want to send them a duplicate. And also sending your passport is a little bit chilling. And so the good news is there is an alternative. If you use something called a certifying acceptance agent, and by the way, that is a person. So I happen to be a certifying acceptance agent. We use the acronym CAAs to describe that. So the good news is there's a list of CAAs at the link, but a lot of CAAs charge a fee. And I have seen some and they'll help you with the W-7 as well. I have seen some CAAs charge over $300. So make sure you know the fees before you engage these individuals. But what they do is they look at your documents, they're trained forensically, and they sign off that your documents were authentic and that they represent you. If you can't find an affordable CAA, then another option is the IRS's Taxpayer Assistance Centers. They have offices in almost all large cities. Here's another link where you can find the office. The problem with the IRS Taxpayer Assistance Centers, they can authenticate your documents and take the and also help you with the W-7 or take the W-7 in your tax return. The problem is they get very busy, especially now during tax season. Again, use a certifying acceptance agent as an alternative to sending in your original documents if you can find one. The good news is there are some programs across the country that include volunteer income tax assistance. So they're called VITA programs. That's, again, another acronym, volunteer income taxpayer assistance. Some of them actually have CAAs on site. So if you can find one of those, it definitely would be worth going to one of those. And they'll prepare your tax return. They'll help you with the W-7. They'll authenticate your documents. So lots of options, not perfect, but better than no options. You can do it yourself, but then you've got to mail in original documents with your tax return. You actually mail all of this to Austin, Texas. You can use a Taxpayer Assistance Center, or you can use a certifying acceptance agent. Help in preparing and filing your taxes. As I said, volunteer income tax assistance sites across the country, and they will, I can't say all of them because there's so many, I don't know everything about all of them, but I know the ones in Nevada will work with individuals who have ITINs. All the VITA sites, they're listed at this website. They typically have very good services for limited English speaking taxpayers, and they generally help people up to $73,000. It's actually higher than this now. index for inflation. The great news is beginning in March, so next month, the IRS is going to have an online free preparing and filing program. That is good for people who already have ITINs, but it really doesn't work for someone who doesn't have an ITIN yet. Another option is online free software at the IRS's website at freefile@irs.gov. So these are online question and answer programs for free that will help you file a tax return. Again, the problem is you're going to have to print it out because you're going to have to mail your tax return. And if you really get in a bind, then what I hope you do is reach out to a low-income taxpayer clinic in your area. They might be able to, if you can't find any of these resources, they might be able to direct you somewhere. They're likely not going to be able to help you, but they can point you in the right direction. If you decide to use a paid preparer, and I hope you find other resources, the IRS does have a good website for finding paid preparers that hopefully have integrity and are registered and are competent. Make sure a paid preparer gives you a copy of your return. Make sure they have you sign your return. Review it to make sure it's accurate because you're responsible for any errors on that. Another thing you might think about doing is going to the IRS website once you get your ITIN and opening an online account with the IRS. And don't forget about your state taxing authority. If you are in a state with an income tax, you're going to have to file a state tax return as well. So go to their websites, and once you have your ITIN, open up an online account. Now, I have seen the chat kind of go viral, and so I know that there are lots of questions out there, and I've talked a little bit too long, but I welcome your questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Francine, for some basic information around ITINs. The chat has been blowing up and I've been kind of keeping track of the questions. So the first question I will ask is, and I answered this in the chat, but briefly, if you can respond, can I apply for an ITIN online?
So unfortunately, the answer is no. And I know that doesn't make sense, but we're moving in the right direction. But the answer now is a big, hard no. Paper.
Thank you. And then what is an educational tax credit?
Great question. Show up next week. Same time, same place. I'm going to go into detail about these educational tax credits. There are two of them. The first one is the American Opportunity Tax Credit. It is for the first 4 years of college, higher education. So perhaps that applies to you. I'm going to give you the details next week, but if you go to the IRS website, they've got great information that goes through the details of these credits. American Opportunity Tax Credit, just the short story, is a tax credit up to $2,500 if you've paid out of pocket, not with a scholarship, at least $4,000 of tuition and fees and required books. So if you get a full ride scholarship, then you don't qualify for this. And then the other tax credit, educational tax credit, the lifetime learning tax credit, that's for college beyond the first 4 years. So I know some of you are law students, that would be relevant to you. That's up to $2,000, 20% of up to $10,000 of out-of-pocket costs and fees. Show up next week, we'll dive into even more details.
Thanks, Francine, for plugging next week's session on tax matters for immigrants and for also answering that question. So the next question I saw in the chat was, my intent was to apply for an ITIN to use to open a savings account. Is there any alternative if the person isn't planning on filing taxes?
No, the number is specifically requires a tax filing obligation. And so the government scrutinizes this, and the proof that you have a tax filing obligation is a tax return. So the answer is no.
And I know, Francine, you talked about this earlier, but I know it's always a common question that pops up. Can you remind everyone of what a tax filing obligation is? That would be helpful.
Yes. So if you are working and your employer gives you a W-2, or if you are an independent contractor and you receive a 1099, let's say you drive for DoorDash, or you are tutoring students, and you receive a 1099 because you're an independent contractor, then you need to file an income tax return. So if you have wages from employment, if you're an independent contractor, and if you qualify for an educational tax credit, the only way you can get it is by filing a tax return.
Thank you for those examples, Professor Lippman. And also as a follow-up, let's say that we have a scholar who babysits for their family or a neighbor, and they're receiving $100 to babysit over the weekend. Would that be considered a tax filing obligation? And could they use that to apply for an ITIN?
Yes, so that is really being an independent contractor, right? You're providing services not as an employee, but as a self-employed babysitter. And so that certainly would be, and hopefully it's more than $100 for the entire year. But it could be, so babysitting, housekeeping, landscaping, all those, to the extent you have income, you're going to have to report it. Now, be careful what you ask for, I guess, because to the extent you're an independent contractor, you have to pay self-employment taxes. And so that is 15.3%. You likely owe income taxes if your income is below about $13,000 for a single person. It's about double that for married filing jointly, but self-employment income is 15.3%. But again, it's important to file the return. And if your income is $1,000, we're not talking about a lot of taxes here.
All right, thank you, Professor Lippman. I do also notice that there's a lag on your end. So I would like to ask you, I guess, if you can stop sharing your screen, and we're going to spotlight you instead as a speaker, and hopefully that will help.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So the next question, can you please restate what makes you qualify for a resident alien?
Yes. So when I think about this characterization, it is pretty much any unauthorized immigrant in the United States today because we do not have a porous border, right? People are not going back and forth. And so the technical rules are, once you have been residing in the United States for more than 183 days, and that counting of days is not just this year, but it's the last 2 years, and it weights, it's complicated, unfortunately, it weights the last 2 years less than 100%. But if you've been in the US for at least half of the year, then you are a resident alien. And as I've said, once most of unauthorized immigrants come in the country, they're stuck here to some extent. And so from there on, they're resident aliens. Again, that's a tax term.
Thank you for answering, Francine. Next question. Are you able to change your address on an ITIN? If so, how? Because my ITIN letter still has my old address.
Don't worry about that. That's absolutely fine. There is a form that you can mail to the IRS to change a change of address form. But the better way to do it is have your current address on your tax return, right? And so for many people, the address on their original ITIN letter is likely not the same letter they're at. So don't worry about that. But of course, on your current tax filings, have your current address. That's actually a great question.
Yes, we have a lot of great questions coming through the chat. So next question, and I believe I can take this one.
Excellent.
Is there an ITIN to employee sponsorship pipeline? What are the best places to seek employment? So I briefly mentioned at the beginning, and I'll re-emphasize that unfortunately ITINs do not grant work authorization. They are not a social security number. ITINs are issued by the IRS for individuals who don't have a social to file and pay taxes. So that's the main reason why an ITIN is issued, is to file and pay taxes. Now, both myself and Francine did briefly mention some additional benefits or uses of how you could use an ITIN. One of them being for entrepreneurial career pathways, such as starting a business, doing freelance or independent contract work. Those type of opportunities are self-employment. So if you're interested in learning more about entrepreneurial career pathways, I would encourage you. We will be hosting our summer career series that happens every July. You can also look at our careers webpage, which has some great resources, and I'll put that in the chat in a minute or two here. Next question. If someone has been denied applying for an ITIN before, does it affect the new application?
Another great question. No, it does not. Unfortunately, it is not unusual that someone is denied. Usually what happens is the IRS sends the application back and asks you to fix something. If you can't fix it, then I guess you're denied. But in many cases, it is not a seamless process. So for example, I've submitted applications and the IRS will send a letter back saying no documents were attached. Well, they were attached when I mailed them in. And so you just resubmit it. So you try to make corrections. But if you filed and then were denied and didn't try to correct whatever the issue was, you can certainly apply again. All
right, great to know. Next question. When you get an ITIN, does it matter that you didn't file taxes before getting it? Will it penalize you for the years you didn't pay taxes?
These questions are always so great. So once you get into the wonderful world of tax return preparing and filing, on a going forward basis, you're somewhat, on the radar, but frankly, you're already, to some extent, if, there's a W-2 with your name and address on it because you had earnings, the government has that information and you need to file taxes. So I guess the short answer is unlikely that they would retroactively require tax filings unless they have information that you had unreported earnings for prior years. There is a statute of limitations on the IRS assessing taxes, but if you never file, it doesn't start. So it is unlikely, but if they have information, again, from your employer reporting income, then they're likely to some extent to track you down anyway. So it's just better to be compliant.
All right, next question, which is similar but different. I just got my ITIN. Does this mean I need to file taxes as soon as possible?
So I would assume if you got an ITIN, it must have been through some sort of tax filing, but there is, so the deadline for filing, and again, come on next Thursday, same time, same place. The deadline for filing your 2023 tax return is April 15th, 2024. You can get an extension, a 6-month extension through October, but it's not to pay your taxes, it's just to file your taxes. So if you aren't going to be able to file by April 15th, you should extend through October 15th. But having the ITIN doesn't put any urgency to filing.
Next question. How does the ITIN work for people that get paid cash?
So regardless of how you're paid, if you have US source income, then you need to report it for tax filing purposes. Unfortunately, if you're being paid cash, not as an employee, that means the person who's paying you that is characterizing you as an independent contractor. And so you're going to owe self-employment taxes on that, which is the 15.3%. So it is likely when you file reporting that cash income that you will owe payroll taxes.
Next question. This is in regards to the form W-7. What should I check for an undocumented dependent of undocumented parents?
And I assume that your parents are filing the tax return. And so you would check, I believe it was box D as in dog, dependent, because your parents are resident aliens if they're in the United States and have been here for more than basically 6 months. And so most kids of unauthorized parents who are also undocumented, they check box D.
Okay, great. And I just confirmed, looking at Form W7, that box D is correct, Francine, as you were saying. Next question. I have had an ITIN when my husband and I filed taxes together. Later on, we separated, and I know he removed me from his taxes. So now if I reapply, will I have to pay for the past taxes I didn't pay?
So it sounds like you were married and you were filing jointly with your spouse when you were married, which is the right thing to do. And then when you become unmarried, you cannot file jointly with the person who you're no longer married to. And so you should have been filing as a single person. Your ITIN may have expired if you haven't been on a tax return for 3 consecutive years. It's important to file, so you're going to have to file for 2023 if you have a tax obligation for 2023, and you're going to have to renew that ITIN again if you haven't been on a tax return for 3 consecutive years. So whether or not you owe taxes, I don't know because I don't know the numbers, but I would definitely file for the current year, 2023, and then renew your ITIN again if you haven't filed with that ITIN for 3 consecutive years.
Next question. I saw 2 questions come in that were similar. Is there a limit for a person to file taxes? In terms of, is there a minimum income threshold? I'm asking because one of my friends only made $2,000 in 2023. And then the similar question asked, is there a minimum income threshold you have to pass to be able to file taxes? I had been told it was $20,000 if I am single, but I'd like to confirm.
So when I talk to individuals who want an ITIN, the good news is you can file. So let's suppose you have I guess the long answer, the short answer is it depends. And it depends upon what that income is. So if you're an independent contractor and you have meaning that you're not an employee, so you're self-employed, and you have $2,000 of income, you're going to need to file a tax return and pay your self-employment taxes, which is 15.3% of $2,000. It's not a lot of money. That creates a tax filing obligation that can allow you to apply for an ITIN. However, there is a standard deduction amount. And so that person with $2,000 will owe self-employment taxes, but they will not owe any income taxes because there's a standard deduction amount, which is about $13,000 if you are single. If you're married, it's double that. If you are a head of household, meaning you have a child in your home for the entire year, it's about $18,000. So it's between those two. Or it might be, maybe that's the number you were thinking about. If you're head of household, then it's closer to 20,000. And so those are deductions for income tax purposes. However, if you work for, if somebody is an employee and even making minimum wage, they have, let's say, $13,000 worth of income, and they have W-2 on a W-2, if their employer withheld taxes, meaning withheld some money from each paycheck then even though that's below the standard deduction of $13,000, they would want to file a tax return to get a refund. And so while your income might be below these standard deduction amounts, you might want to file to get any withholding paid back, or to get one of these educational tax credits. The American Opportunity Tax Credit has a refundable component up to $1,000. So even if you don't have a tax obligation, you can get this credit. And so it's not as easy as what's the dollar amount of the limit. I wish I had an easier answer.
Well, thank you, Francine. Your wealth of knowledge has been very helpful. I'm glad we're recording this so people can refer back to it. We have a few more minutes, so I'm going to try to go through at least 2 more questions. When you say certified copies, does that need to be by the agency, or can they be certified, translated copy?
Great question. It is from the original agency, unfortunately. And so that really is, and it is not a notarized copy. So it's a certified copy from the issuing agency. So you'd have to go back maybe to your birth country to get a certified copy of your birth certificate. Unfortunately, that's often not very easy.
Next question. I went to an H&R Block this week and they told me that the only way I can file for an ITIN was by checking box D, dependent of a US citizen. They told me that IRS has changed their rules and that I couldn't get an ITIN on my own unless I was claimed by a citizen on their return. Is this accurate? They told me I would get denied if I applied on my own.
So unfortunately, these rules are so complicated, and I know I'm not going to shock you when I say H&R Block preparers are not the brightest bulbs in the pack. But in any case, if you have a tax filing obligation, you can file for an ITIN on your own. And it is true that it is more challenging for dependents to be claimed on a parent's tax return. Those rules have become a little bit more complicated, but you clearly can be a dependent on under many circumstances for another ITIN holder who is not a US citizen. So they didn't get it exactly right. But you need the tax filing obligation to file on your own.
And before I ask the last question too, do know that if any of your questions didn't get answered, we will be having another ITINs Open Doors webinar in mid-March. So keep an eye out for that. We will also be having a week from today, same time, with Professor Littman talking about tax matters specifically for undocumented immigrants. So we invite you to attend that as well. The last question I will ask is, my request to file an ITIN got rejected, but they gave me a temporary one. Do I still need to file taxes?
That doesn't sound exactly right. So I've never seen that. So are you sure you got a temporary ITIN? And you always have to file a tax return if you have an obligation to file a tax return, right? So regardless of whether you have an ITIN or not, if you have a tax filing obligation, you have to apply for an ITIN and file a tax return. So it's kind of the opposite. Just having an ITIN doesn't create the tax filing obligation, but earning income whether as an employee or whether as an independent contractor or winning the lottery. I hope you all win the lottery. You know, having huge gambling winnings in Las Vegas, those all create tax filing obligations. And so it's not the ITIN that creates it. So that's a good question.
Yeah, and I saw that in the chat and I was unsure myself, so that's why I asked. If any of you have any further questions, Nicole and myself did just put in Francine's email in the chat, so you are welcome to email Francine directly yourself. Thank you everyone for coming, wonderful questions. I hope you learned a lot about ITINs. Thank you, Professor Lippman, as always, for being our ITIN expert, and we will see you again next week on Tax Matters for Immigrants.
And next week, we're going to focus on the tax preparing and filings rather than the ITINs. Yep.
Correct, correct. So hopefully we'll see a good number of you next week as well. All right, everyone, take care and enjoy the upcoming weekend. Bye.
Long weekend.